Hey guys, so this video is about chapter 20 from your textbook, and we're going to talk about short-term financial planning. So in your previous chapter, in chapter 19, we did talk about longer-term financial planning, and we did look at a couple of growth rates, the concepts of internal growth rate and the concepts of external growth rate. So this chapter will be focusing a lot more on cash forecasting and the uses of cash, and how to manage your receivables and payables and forecasting those uses. So before we do that, let's actually quickly look into the links between the long-term and short-term financing. Right. So there are different kinds of firms. This is best explained by these in some sort of like figures. So this figure tells you the x-axis is time, and the y-axis can be thought of as the total capital requirement. So let's assume this firm has some sort of like a seasonal component, right? Like sometimes you'll have to like ramp up your inventories, then you sell a lot. Then you have to really ramp up your inventories, and then like you don't have to like, and your raw materials which you obtain, you might be getting it at different points in time because your supplier might not be giving you a little bit of raw material every day. It might be once a month, it might be once a quarter, it might be once in 6 months, right? So for these purposes, the total capital requirements required by this firm can sort of vary in some sense, right? And this black line represents like what you could call as like the base level of long-term assets and long-term base level of long-term assets and the current assets and so on. So this is in some sense another example of where it's the same thing. Like let's say you have money, the total capital requirement, and over time, right? So you have these sort of like seasonal variations, and certain firms. So this can be thought of like firms like Apple and Microsoft and companies with huge amounts of cash balances. They have way more cash, which is the long-term financing, which is the black line over here. So for Apple and Microsoft and certain firms which are very, very profitable, the amount of cash which they generate, if they do not return all of it to the shareholders, they would have enough cash balances in order to get through this sort of seasonal variation. So whenever they have like a lot of excess capital, this excess capital is usually invested in some sort of short-term treasury bills or short-term commercial paper, these sort of short-term securities, which are known as marketable securities. And whenever the variations kind of are low, they don't invest that much money into these short-term securities. So this sort of firm is known as having this sort of strategy is known as having a very relaxed strategy. So the firm is always has enough money, and it always invests money, or in some sense, it is the lender of money. Okay, so here in this strategy, if you could try and think about it, in this sort of scenario, the firm is almost always a borrower of money. So here it's borrowing money, here it's not really borrowing money, and here it's borrowing money again, you know. So this is another example. We already saw the restrictive strategy where the firm is always a borrower in some time or in some aspect or the other. And so this is in some sense the figure in B. It's like the middle of the road, and there'll be certain times of the year where the firm will be a short-term borrower, and there'll be certain times where they hold, like post-holiday season, the firm might have a little bit of excess cash, and they might have invest in some sort of short-term marketable securities. And then when it becomes time to like purchase a lot of raw materials over here, the excess cash starts being used towards purchasing inventory and raw materials. And they again receive a lot of money, and then they become a borrower. So they need a lot of money, and they become a borrower. These are different strategies in terms of how to manage your short-term financial needs. And accordingly, you will be borrowing money from banks, like, or stretching your accounts payables, or and implement various strategies like that. Okay, so certain ways to actually deal with this is one way, which we talked about even before, is to try and match maturities and also always have permanent working capital requirements. So working capital is managing your working capital and liquidity is very important, especially for small firms, right? But there are also costs in some sense, right? If you always hold a lot of money, if you have a bunch of extra cash, this extra cash investing in these sort of short-term marketable securities, what is the return on the securities you get? In today's environment, you get close to nothing, right? Like you get 0.25%, 0.5%. So you get very, very, very little return if you hold a bunch of excess cash. So this excess cash, in some sense, is not really being used to get the best return. So these are some problems with holding excess cash, right? So your textbook actually has an example. Well, it's not on the slides, but your textbook actually has an example. It's actually page number 620. In your textbook, it's about the company LA Gear. So if you have a bunch of excess cash, you could absorb losses. Yes, if you have a bad quarter or a bad year, you could absorb losses. But from a shareholder's perspective, you're using excess cash to hide poor strategies or poor managements, and even without certain strategies being successful, or unsuccessful strategies you could hide these poor management decisions with excess cash for long periods of time. So that's a problem. That's a cost to holding excess cash. So what's the other problem, right? Like, so the other problem is if you're always if you're a restrictive borrower, if you're almost always a borrower, and here you tend to have issues, right? So here, if you're trying to always borrow money, like when markets kind of freeze up, like which happened during the pandemic, you'll be forced to borrow money at much higher rates because everyone is scared in some sense, right? So these are costs of being always a short-term borrower, because you depend on the markets and you're making use of leverage to, in some sense, get returns, but you're also putting your company at risk. And if the cost of this short-term borrowing become way too high, you might be forced to sell certain assets. Like you might be forced to sell your receivables at a discount, and you might be forced to sell your inventories at a discount, and in order to raise cash. And typically, those are very value losing in some sense. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens like once every business cycle of the very least for many firms. Okay, so once we actually talk about that, the biggest parts of short-term financing is about, the main idea is behind managing the working capital, right? So the managing the working capital is about managing current assets and current liabilities. Okay, so and these are the list of current assets and list of current liabilities which we're talking about. And typically, when we talk about working capital, we are also talking about managing and knowing what the operating cycle is. So just a quick refresher, what is the operating cycle from your accounting courses? You should remind. So it's the period of time from the purchase of the raw materials to the collection of cash from the sale of finished goods. Okay, so you have your cash, you purchase material, you get your finished goods, inventory, you sell it to your customer or you sell it to the store, and you wait like a month. For a month, it's or 2 or 3 months or whatever it is, it's in the receivables. And finally, whoever you sold it to, they give the cash and you get the cash back. So this is in some sense known as the operating cycle. And this figure actually makes it very, very clear. Okay, so the operating cycle is known as the full length of this thing. So you're purchasing your raw materials, pay for them, you finish your goods, like sale of finished goods happens at the end of inventory period, and accounts receivable happens for a few months or whatever, and finally you get the cash. So your operating cycle, in some sense, is the inventory period plus your accounts receivable period. Okay, and similarly, you have something known as the accounts payable period, and this is how much you delay the amount you pay something. When you're buying the raw materials, you pay the raw materials a month or two later. So this payment is being delayed. So the overall cash conversion cycle can be thought of as the operating cycle overall, which is the inventory period plus the accounts receivable period, subtract or minus out the accounts payable period, right? And each of these periods or the time period is given by these sort of formulas which you have learned in accounting before. Okay, so the inventory period is the inventory divided by annual cost of sales divided by 365. Same thing for receivables. For accounts payable, instead of cost of sales, you use cost of goods sold. Okay, and so these are your receivables. So your textbook also gives you an example, which is given in your slides as well. So let's quickly go through this example. So here you have revenues, cost of sales, inventory, receivables, payables. So these are like very simplified financial statements. and we are trying to figure out how long did it take on average, and what was the operating cycle and the cash conversion cycle. How long did it take for them to produce and sell their product? So let's do the inventory period first. What is the inventory period? Inventory is given to you, cost of sales is given to you, and you can easily, works out to 101 days. And the average good sits in your warehouse or whatever storage for around 100 days, which is fairly high. Accounts receivable similarly is found out. So I think there's a mistake in this formula. It's actually correct. Accounts payable is 71 and accounts receivable is 35. Okay, so once you actually have these days, your operating cycle is pretty much at inventory and receivables time period, and that's 136 days, and the cash conversion cycle is 65 days where you're subtracting out the payables. So on average, it takes you 65 days for you to actually try and, like, once you put your money for you to get back your money in some sense. And we already talked about some of the trade-offs of maintaining, like, what is the problem if you have too much working capital, if you have too much cash, if you have too much inventory. That cash could be used in something else, right? Like 100 days of something sitting in your on your warehouse might not be the best day. Like, you might be able to reduce this, right? So whenever you're trying to reduce your working capital requirements, your net effect is you're freeing some sort of cash. Okay, so this is an important way to try and think about working capital management. The costs, again, right, there's carrying costs, but there's other kinds of costs. You cannot really, if you start going and delaying your accounts payable, let's say, one way to increase your or reduce your cash conversion cycle is to delay payments, right? If you start delaying payments, eventually your suppliers, whoever is supplying the raw materials to you, would not be willing to lend you the material, right? Like, you're not a reliable customer, so they'll start charging you higher fees, or they'll start charging you higher interest rates. They'll give you penalties if you keep delaying your payments. And similarly, accounts receivable, ideally you would want to be paid as soon as possible, and you would want to delay your payments as much as possible. But if you keep nagging your customers for quicker and quicker payments, someone else, if there some other supplier can potentially get contracts with them by offering a slightly more relaxed term of accounts receivable, right? So these are certain things which you could kind of you have to be careful about as a manager, even if you're ever running a short-term business as well, right? Like, you can't just shorten this too much, and you cannot extend this too much as well. So something which is a little more in your control is inventory, right? So, but inventory also, you should not have too reduced levels of inventory, because suddenly, if you have very small levels of inventory, you might not be able to bid on certain orders. If you're losing out on certain bids and auction, like because it might be too big for you because you're not that big of a company, that could be a problem if you have very little inventory. But if you have enough raw material for certain big orders, you might be immediately able to get that order. So it really depends on the business, and you'll have to think what is the right inventory period, accounts receivable period, and accounts payable period for each industry, for each business. It's a unique thing. So there's no standard answer as to what's the optimal amount. It varies. So having said that, the next part of this chapter focuses on figuring out and finding cash and forecasting the uses of cash. And I'll upload that in a separate video. That is it for this video. I'll see you on the next video. Bye-bye.